Today's focus is going to be on creating this planet with rings as well. If you want to see an in-depth tutorial on how to create cinematic planets, you can check out this video over here, but we will be going through a much more simplified version in this video. So with that, let's actually begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we'll just tap X to delete the default cube and then press Shift A and search for a mesh UV sphere. Then we can press S5 to scale it up by 5 units, and to make this nice and smooth, we'll press Ctrl 2 to add in a subdivision surface of level 2. If you want it to be even better, you can press Ctrl 3 and that way it becomes very smooth. But if you do zoom in, you can still see these squares. So we'll go to Object and select Shade Smooth so that it becomes a perfect sphere. Apart from that, in our modifier properties, we're going to have to increase the render to 3 as well so that it renders the same way we can see it in the viewport. Now before we start texturing, we'll go to our render properties, switch on bloom and screen space reflections, and we'll switch our viewport shading to rendered so that we can actually see the changes that we make. We'll also go to our world properties and just change this background color to a complete black. Then we'll select our default light and we'll press Alt G to clear its location and then GX to move it to the side. Apart from that, in our light properties, we'll just increase the radius to make this much softer, and we'll increase the power as well to something like 5000 watts. Once we're happy with that, we can actually start texturing this particular planet. So we'll select the planet, we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window and change this from the 3D viewport to the shader editor. Then we'll select the default material for now because we aren't using that for anything, and we'll start texturing. We're going to make this very simple and fast to render by not using any bump and just using a single Musgrave texture. In the Musgrave texture, we're going to change this from FBM to ridged multifractal, and we're going to plug the height directly into the base color. Now we'll press Shift A and search for a color ramp so that we can have control over the actual colors, and then we'll start playing around with the actual values. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll increase the detail all the way to 15, and then I'll just increase the gain to something like 150, and finally we'll just reduce the dimension down, maybe 0.1 will give us this nice planet-like texture. Then to actually change the colors, we'll take this white and we'll change it from a white to maybe a slightly bluish hint like that, and then we'll change our roughness all the way to 1 so that it becomes completely rough. You can also play around with these sliders to make more or less of it black or white, but I think just crunching them in like this is good enough. Apart from this, we want there to be some sort of glow at the edge to act like an atmosphere, so I'm going to do that with just the emission. So I'll press Shift A and search for a layer weight node, and I'll search for a color ramp so that we have more control. Now I'll take the facing value and plug it into the factor, and then I'll take this color and plug it into the emission strength. For the actual emission color, maybe we can give it a greenish atmosphere, some sort of a toxic environment. So I'll just lift this up a bit and choose a slightly greenish hue. Now of course that's way too strong, so let's just reduce this out by bringing this black slider in, or we can also increase the blend value as well, or reduce it till you get the effect that you're looking for. So if you switch off overlays, you can see what it currently looks like, and that's all right. Although this area is a bit too bright, we'll play around with this just a bit after we create the background, and even this dark region is lit up a bit because I don't want this to be pitch black either. Once you're done with that, we can actually start off with the rings. So let's press Shift A and search for a mesh plane. We'll scale this up, and the idea is to create the fastest possible rings that render out fairly fast. So let's just increase this to maybe a scale of 10 or 12 and then add in a new material by pressing this button. Now to actually make it turn into rings, we'll press Shift A and search for a wave texture, and I'll press Ctrl T with the node wrangler enabled to get the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Now I'll switch from generated to object, and I'll switch this wave texture from bands to rings, and I'll change the axis from X to spherical. You could choose Z as well, but I like to keep it spherical so that in case we do rotate it in edit mode for whatever reason it may be, the rings remain proper. Now we can Control Shift click the wave texture to actually see what we have, and clearly these are rings, but they're not random enough to be rings of a planet. To add in that randomness, we'll search for a noise texture and plug that in after the wave texture. Then to have better control, we'll press Shift A and search for a color ramp node and plug that in right after the noise texture and just bring this in by a bit. Now we see we have a repeating pattern, so we don't want to have this repeating pattern, so we just reduce this scale from 5 to something like 1, and that way it just increases in size and the repeating pattern is less noticeable. We can reduce it even more if we want, so let's go with maybe 0.5, and let's increase the scale of the noise texture as well to maybe 10. Now since we want the rings to be present not too close to the planet and obviously not till the edge of this ring, we're going to use another mix color node, and we'll switch it from mix to multiply and plug that in after the color ramp. We'll increase the factor all the way to 1, and we need to multiply it with another mask that we create. So for the mask, we'll press Shift A and search for a gradient texture, and we'll switch this from linear to spherical. And for the actual vector, we'll take a mapping coordinate by just pressing Shift D with that one and taking this object coordinate and plugging it into the vector. Now we can take this vector and plug it in and take this color and plug it into socket B of the multiply node. Again, for better control, we're going to go ahead and take this color ramp and press Shift D to duplicate it and plug it down here. And this time we're going to change this from linear to constant, and then we can just bring these sliders in till we get what we want. So obviously I want there to be rings till about this edge over here, and then I'll press Control click to add in a new stop, and this time I'll change this stop from white to black. Of course, if Control click is not working for you, just press this plus button to add in a new stop and change it to black and just bring it so that you get the limits of your rings. So once you're happy with the positioning of your rings, you can just play around with the noise texture and things like that till you make the rings look exactly like what you want. Once you're happy with that, we actually don't want the black areas to remain black. We want them to become see-through. So we'll take this multiply node and plug it into the alpha of the principled BSDF, and then we'll plug the principled BSDF into the material output. Now for it to actually become see-through, we're going to have to go to the material properties, go all the way down and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend or alpha hashed. Shadow mode, you can also switch over to none. So now if your blend mode is set to alpha blend, you're going to get nice smooth lines just like this. And of course that might be what you want, in which case you can keep it just like this. But in case you want it to seem more rocky, one thing you could do is instead of keeping it at alpha blend, you could keep it at alpha hashed. By switching it over to alpha hashed, you'll get this really fine noisy texture, which you could remove by increasing the samples. But since we don't want to remove that, we'll keep the samples just as it is at something low like 32 or 16, and you get this fine grain effect that makes it look like it's made up of actual rocks. However, because we're keeping the samples fairly low, when you animate this, it might look like these rocks are slightly teleporting and things like that. It might not look like they're all rotating around the planet. In case you want to get it to look like it's rotating around the planet when you're animating, so we can switch the blend mode to alpha blend and actually use a fine noise texture to create the actual rocky material. So for that, we're going to have to multiply it in with the noise texture. So let's take this multiply node, press Shift D and duplicate it right there, and then press Shift A and search for a noise texture. Now for the noise texture, we'll increase the scale to something really high, and we'll take a color ramp node. So let's select this and press Shift D to duplicate it, plug the color into the factor, and take this color and plug it into socket B of the multiply node. That way, when you view it from afar, it does look like it has that rocky material. And of course, if you want to increase the scale even more, instead of changing the scale, you can just increase the roughness and the detail and things like that to make it very rocky. You can always decrease the amount of black so that more of it is visible, and that way you should get a nice smooth animation as well when you animate it. Once you're done with that, you can start off with the background. So let's switch from object to world, and then we'll just press Shift A and search for a noise texture, and we'll be using this noise texture for the strength of the background. Again, for better control, we'll press Shift A and search for a color ramp node as well as a math node. So let's plug the color into the factor and then press Shift A and search for a math node so that we can actually scale the value down and make it less intense. So let's change this from add to multiply and then plug this value into the strength. Now for the actual background color, let's just lift it by a little bit for now and then play around with the noise texture till we get something that we're happy with. So I want the scale to be fairly low. Let's keep it at 1, and I'll just increase the detail up as well as the roughness up to maybe 0.8, and then I'll bring this black value in so that we just have some slight clouds present here and there. Once I'm happy with this distribution, I can go ahead and actually play around with the color. For the color, I'll use another noise texture. So let's just duplicate this and now again use another color ramp so that we can choose the appropriate colors. Since I have green hues over here and a bluish planet, I'm going to change this black value to maybe a very dark greenish color, and then this white to a very dark bluish color, just like that. But I have to make sure that the value is fairly low. Then I'll take this color from the noise texture, plug it into the factor, and take this color output and plug it into the color of the background. Once it's done, you can play around with this multiply node till you're able to just see the background, and of course play around with this noise texture till you're able to see both the green and the blue fairly well. Now I think that looks good enough, but I forgot to change the color of these rings. So let's select the rings again, go back from world to object, and for the base color you can just change this to whatever color you want. I'll go with a slightly bluish hue and I'll increase the roughness all the way to 1. With that, you can start the animation. So let's go to our output properties, change the end frame to 600 so that it's a 10-second long animation at 60 frames per second or 20-second long animation at 30 frames per second. Output folder can be wherever you want it to be. File format, we're going to choose FFmpeg video. Encoding, we're going to change from Matroska to MPEG-4, and output quality we'll keep at perceptually lossless. Then we'll press Shift A and search for an empty plane axis, and we'll just scale it up so that it can be seen clearly. Then we'll select both the rings and the planets by Shift and selecting, and then finally we'll select the empty and we'll press Ctrl P, set parent to object. Then we can select the rings and the planet and then just rotate it on the y-axis by a very slight amount, maybe 4 degrees, and that way when we we rotate the empty, there will be a slight wobble in the rings as well, which looks fairly good, in my opinion. So to actually animate the empty, we're going to press the back arrow to go to frame 0 and then hover over our 3D viewport and tap I rotation with the empty selected. And then we'll go to the last frame, so frame 600, and we'll press RZ 360 so that it rotates by one full rotation, and then we'll tap I rotation. Down here, we'll press T linear so that we get a single seamless loop. Then to place our camera, we'll just select the camera, press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, and then we'll press RX90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Then we'll press GY to just bring it back by a bit, and then we'll press 0 to go into our camera view. Now we'll tap N to open this side panel, and we'll go to view and choose lock camera to view, and that way we can move our camera around as we would generally move anything in our 3D viewport. So let's just place it into something that looks much better. And remember, if you want to rotate it in weirder ways, you can just press RZ twice to rotate it about the Z-axis and things like that, so that you get rotations that you can't do normally. So once you have it placed exactly where you want it and everything's looking fine, all you have to do is press render animation. I hope this was a fun one and it actually taught you something useful. Be sure to check out my original planet tutorial, and you can definitely add in rings to that one as well. Beyond that, I also have a time lapse of where I created something like this before, which was an apocalyptic planet. You can check that video out as well right over here. And in case you want a tutorial on that one, do let me know and I'll create a tutorial on that as well. Until my next video comes out tomorrow, check out other videos on my channel because I post videos every single day and there are hundreds of videos that are just waiting for you to discover them. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to keep creating and stay creative.